We started. All right. Well, hashtag RTBTH. That's the podcast. Real talk beyond the headlines. This is your co-host, Tunde. Big shout to Herschel and Ehi, the other co-hosts. But today we have some very special guests. For some people who have listened to the podcast, you'll know that I am working on my degree in counseling psychology to be a psychologist. And guess what? I have two other psychology students here with us today. God damn it. Today's a good day. We have some topics to discuss, but let's introduce our guests. We have Darrick and Kalo. Darrick, what's good?
Yo, yeah, so it's Darrick. As you said, Tunde, I'm studying clinical psych. Yeah, and I'm a part of a fellowship at BMC. And yeah, I'm very much interested in Black mental health and doing a lot of work with Black populations around anxiety, depression, trauma, etc. So yeah, that's pretty much me, and I'll pass it off.
Appreciate you, Darrick. Kalo, what's good?
Hey Tunde, thanks for having me. So my name is Kalo Sokoto. I am an international student from Kenya, and I'm doing my PhD in counseling psychology at West Virginia University. And I'm currently in Boston doing my fellowship at the Center for Multicultural Training in Psychology with Darrick. Yeah, glad to be here.
Yes, lovely. So this is the world that we wait in every single day is mental health. And in our clinical practices and our research, a lot of that mental health is the mental health of minority individuals, things like that. We're working to become licensed psychologists. Darrick and Kalo are so damn close without telling too much information, but they have made some significant milestones in recent months. So big shout to y'all. Big shout to the international psychology training experience, because I'm sure that is very complicated, very hard. But we need and we really need your perspective in this world, in this profession. So I'll give a little bit of a background, but Darrick, I think you can probably elaborate in more detail. But we came together to go to an event in Brockton, Massachusetts. We're all here in Boston, but in Brockton, Massachusetts, Dr. Umar Johnson, the school psychologist and the firebrand commentator, perhaps is one way of describing him, spoke right there in the flesh. Darrick, can you give us a little bit of background, just, how you heard about it, how you brought us together?
Yeah, so as you said, Dr. Umar, Dr. Ifa Tunde, or the Prince of the self-proclaimed Prince of Pan-Africanism, made his rounds on the internet over the past 10 years, with going viral on different various platforms, and has taken the conscious what's called the conscious community by storm in terms of enlightening folks on just the state of the race for Black people in the African diaspora, Black people of African descent trying to connect to Africa and a sense of empowerment in a society of racism and colonization. So I think he's done a lot for increasing awareness through some of his interviews, books, lectures, and things like that. So I got word of his sort of lecture through social media. Different flyers and things came around, and I saw that he had a state of the race lecture where he was sort of giving an update on where things are in terms of the challenges and barriers facing people of African descent, and sort of giving solutions, ideas, perspective on how to move forward properly. So, of course, I thought about two of the greatest thinkers in my circle, and just in my encounters in Boston, and wanting to get perspective. I think it's so important when encountering visionaries, people who offer such solutions, to really sit with like-minded individuals and strategize and think about, what about this works? What about this feels right? What about this feels right, but maybe may not land well with our community or may not land well with certain parts of our community. How do we hold that and how do we move forward? So I just wanted to share perspective with like minds, and I tapped in, and we got together, and we had a time. So
we did. And thank you, Darrick, for bringing us together. That was my first time meeting Kalo. Pleasure to meet you. But we vibe on many levels. I had sort of ascertained very quickly. We vibe on many levels. So we'll talk about like the actual event in a second. But Kalo, any thoughts just about like that initial coming together, going to Dr. Umar, like kind of that expectation of seeing him?
Yeah. So that whole point that Darrick just made about like minds, like just coming together with folks that we share a similar vibe in one way or another, but specifically just as Dr. Umar Johnson he brings an alternative voice to psychology, which is so rare in our training. Our training is very Eurocentric, and so for me, I remember the first time I heard about Dr. Umar Johnson was from one of my mentors, who's from Chicago actually, but he lives in Kenya. And I just remember thinking, wow, like there's a different way of thinking, and one that includes us. So, Dr. Umar Johnson, just as a person that loves people, but loves Black people and centers Black people in psychology, was so important to me. And then, so there's that, and then there's the part of going for this meeting with the both of y'all. I think that was so new for me as well. So my training has been again in predominantly white institutions, and so I have not had the opportunity to just roll with Black psychologists. So for me, it was yes, it was awesome meeting Dr. Umar, but it was also just very awesome going to listen to Dr. Umar with two other Black psychologists. Like that was, we've been in school for long, but if you think about 4 years of undergrad, 2 years of master's, and 5 years of postdoc, and this is the first time I'm rolling with Black psychologists, like when I'm finishing my PhD. That's serious. That's actually very concerning, very concerning for any Black psychologist. And so that was big for me, like being with you two in that space. Yeah. And the same goes for this podcast. So Tunde, shout out to you as well for kind of bringing us together in this space.
Absolutely.
Yes,
Hashtag RTBTH is the name of the podcast. I know our big co-host Herschel would love to be speaking about these topics, so we probably going to have to get him on the podcast in the future. It might have to be DKTH.
Right.
I don't know. That doesn't sound as good. That doesn't sound as good as DKT, but big shout Herschel. I just want to say, I don't want to disparage our profession because I absolutely love psychology and love mental health, but to me, it's hella white. The same way skiing is hella white. Just to give you some information, 1% of professional psychologists are Black men. I believe about 3% of professional psychologists are Black women. So, I don't think every statistic should align with population statistics, but if you go with that sort of metric, there's underrepresentation. So when Kalo says this is the first time she's going to this sort of event with other Black psychologists, it's pretty like unfortunate, but it's also the standard, the expectation. The APA also, you say that Dr. Umar Johnson brings a different voice, and he says it, and he brings that voice very loudly. We'll talk about shortly in his presentation. But the APA, the American Psychological Association, but also the American Psychiatric Association, just to let you guys know, and for the listeners, the actual APA is the American Psychological Association. It's apa.org for American Psychology and psychiatry.org for APA, American Psychiatric Association. Just putting that out there. We are the APA, but both APAs have released apologies to Black people since George Floyd. I think psychiatry was 2021. I believe psychology was 2022. So there's acknowledgement in the field that there's been some disparity, whether it's in the voices of people who are of a part of the field, but also, I mean, I think both apologies were specifically talking about were issues that these professions have perpetrated upon people of color.
You heard it here first. We finally made it. Welcome to RTBTH. Real talk beyond the headlines. It's about to get real. RTBTH, 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 RTBTH. 5 letters, 5 words. Spell it out. 5 letters, 5 words. Spell it out. 5 letters, 5 words. Spell it out. Good talk beyond the headlines. Beyond the headlines.
Okay, so let's go ahead and get into the event that we went to. Dr. Umar Johnson came to Brockton to speak. I guess he does lectures regularly for the community, for Black people. He spoke a lot about students' experiences in schools, Black boys mostly, but some talk about Black girls. I hadn't realized like he was so adept at school psychology. I guess he's a school psychologist, but I guess in my mind and in the media, you just see him as this like commentator of Black stuff, you know, Black people's experiences and Pan-Africanism, but he's actually a well-spoken school psychologist. But I want to kind of maybe discuss a little bit about the priors, if you will, of prior to actually seeing him speak. And, you know, I'll be honest, I think I really only knew him profoundly through a Breakfast Club interview that he did maybe 4, 5, 6 months ago. He was very abrasive in his speech. I thought that he spoke some things that were very on the Breakfast Club, but also in person, that were very proactive for Black people. But, you know, things just get so caught up in the Pan-Africanism and, you know, his thoughts on like interracial marriage and things like that. And I think some of it's problematic, but when you sit there and listen to him, he speaks a lot about optimism and progress and strength for Black people. And that for me is really hard to ever argue against. So frankly, I'm still trying to make sense of Dr. Umar in my head. You know, I have to show respect and appreciation because he's a psychologist, you know, but he has a pretty hard stance on some particular race relations. But I'm happy to say that I've gained maybe an iota of clarity after hearing him in person. But yourselves, your priors of Dr. Umar Johnson.
Yeah, so kind of similar. I got introduced to him through the Breakfast Club. I think he's been on there maybe like 5 or 6 times. And I felt like I just kind of watched his journey from the first visit and just how it evolved in terms of his message, in terms of the views, and just, you know, for me, it was just about keeping tabs on the Black voice, on a conscious Black voice in the media, in the public media, and just seeing like, how does this work? Like, how does this play out? Like, and for me, I don't know if if there is a voice that speaks to what he speaks to that degree, that has gotten that sort of like publicity, who has had that sort of rapport with the hip hop sort of music entertainment community, the younger generation. Like, I think bridging that has been very, very key and just sort of salient in his movement over the years. So that's sort of my encounter, just sort of softly watching his Breakfast Club interviews. I don't know if there is much else that I've encountered in terms of his output. There's definitely like different YouTube videos that happen. I think he goes live on Instagram and things like that. So I've caught some of those in the past few years, but I think it largely started from the Breakfast Club for me, and just sort of being curious and like, where's this Black voice going, you know?
Yeah. For me, like I said earlier, I was introduced to him by a man called Curtis Reed. And this was when I was in Kenya for my undergrad. That's why I did my undergraduate studies. And I was doing psychology, and I was part of a club, students club called Agenda Africa. And basically the agenda was people of African descent. So within the continent, without the continent, just discussing things that matter to us, and that are with the premise that these things are rarely discussed in our education system. And so we had to create a space to discuss things that matter to us. And if you realize, I just said that my education was in Kenya, which is in Africa, yet the system was not discussing things that centered us as Africans. So that itself, it just gives you an idea of what the climate, the education climate feels like, as you're asking questions about yourself, who you are, and how you fit into this world, and your education system doesn't have answers for you. So I was in this club where we were discussing things that mattered to us. And Curtis Reed was one of the mentors for that club. He's a professor, and he's an African-American professor who was teaching philosophy in the university I had gone to. I was at the Eastern University. And so he introduced Dr. Umar as from the angle of, from his expertise as a psychologist, but also as an education, as someone who values education, and specifically education of Black and brown children. And so my encounter with Dr. Umar Johnson was very, very liberating for me, because I was the first time I was reading his work, or watching his stuff, it was his critique of like fundamental psychological theories, and just his critical perspective was just refreshing. It wasn't even for me about whether it's right or wrong. It was just like, whoa, someone just took a jump at this. Someone has the audacity to challenge Maslow's theory. I was just like, that was exciting to me. I was like,
Yes.
so I wasn't, and then it was a Black man at that was able to do that. And so that just got me excited. But that was, when I was in undergrad, and then I've since developed, and I've also grown, and I've been more exposed and all that stuff. And so I feel like it was really nice to see him in person, because I saw him with time, after so much time of being introduced to his work, and it was a really new and refreshing way of engaging with him again. But that was my prior. So my prior was like, whoa, did you just do that? Did you just say Maslow? No, Maslow. So that was fresh. That was fresh. That was fresh for me.
You make some good points, Kalo. Our profession, the researchers, the academic psychologists, they research conformity, but I don't know if it's really well explained or well discussed, like the amount of conformity that goes into like the training to become a psychologist, and the theories that stand the test of time, which sound great. I think Maslow is like a sensible theory. I don't know how much there's like of a research empirical evidence base for it, but it sounds really nice. The Maslow's hierarchy of needs, for those who are unaware, but it also makes sense. Like, it's probably not going to make sense for Africans. Perhaps doesn't make even sense for African Americans in the United States. So he's very bold and confident in his ability Dr. Umar Johnson, in his ability to really, challenge the concepts of psychology, the theories, the sort of status quo. So on to the actual event. I mean, I have to say, I think the man is such a fantastic orator. I mean, the booming voice, the jokes, the humor, the eye contact. I was sitting off to the side a little bit, but I'm sure he was looking at people dead in the eye. The willingness to say some things that are kind of crazy, he made this, he was talking about how he has a conscious singles conference, and he said Black women cannot get in there unless they have natural hair. And it was funny, but I think he was also dead ass serious.
Yes.
The delivery. So that's what stood out to me first. Y'all can comment on that or other things, but we'll discuss more the actual content of his discussion, but just what were those sort of like? What was the feeling of being around him like?
I think kind of like you, Tunde. Like I was caught in like his charisma. I think he has such an amazing way of keeping the audience close, kind of like we're in a huddle, or like he's giving people a hug. And I think that means a lot, because even if you're there and the message doesn't resonate, or if there are sort of misunderstandings, it communicates a good intention, possibly like a well intended sort of sharing. And I think I'm glad that at the least that's like what we can take away from being in spaces where we're attempting to experience solidarity, or attempting to understand this like extremely complex thing called racism, and as well as colonialism. Like, these things are so disruptive that any attempts to understand them, like, I think it may be difficult to make full sense of it, and I think that's something that I'm like just taking away from being in those spaces, and just thinking like, what should I expect from people who really want to figure this thing out and give it their all. And I think I was just glad to be in a space with somebody who was really, who I felt was really thinking through things and really trying to give it their all. So I think that was my initial takeaway from being in this space. Like, wow, like, listen to this voice. It made me feel like I was in church in some ways. Like, I was like, you can tell that he's kind of somebody who spent some time around people who spoke greatly, and people who had a convicting message. So that's something that kind of felt familiar to me. And I think it's so nice to have I don't know, just a traditional way of sharing and hearing things. I just value that. It may not mean a lot to other people, but I felt like something about my past was coming back up to me, given that I personally spent a lot of my youth in in the church with my mother. So just having that feel of someone who was calling for more just resonated. So
yeah, I thought to myself, like, he didn't appear to be like really promoting anything in a heavy way. I feel like when you come and see people, and it was kind of packed out, so his presence was sort of expected and received in a mild celebratory way, celebrity-ish way, whatever. Forget butchered that, but like, people kind of were expecting and wanting him there. He wasn't promoting nothing. He wasn't like posting the Instagram this and that. He did promote his book, which, by the way, if you write a book, you have every right, in my opinion, to promote it as much as you want.
Absolutely.
But like you said, Darrick, it felt like, just come and talk, hear what this man has to say. I mean, he took 20 questions, 25 questions, was it? I think he obviously has like a need to have a business or some sort of like, career aspirations, I guess you could say. But I feel it felt as if his drive was for the people. So I hear what you're saying, Darrick. Anyway, Kalo, what are your thoughts on just like that presence? Any takeaways you had just in general from hearing his talk?
Yeah. So I feel like one of the first things that I felt when I was in that space was, like both of you have alluded to, that people showed up. People showed up. This is this room was packed. It was packed, and guys, like, we came from far. So I'm curious where folks were even coming from. But I don't think we were the only ones that came from far. Basically,
I'm thinking this was a good number of people came from Boston. Well, and by the way, Boston and Brockton is about 25 miles apart. So it's a bit of a drive.
It's a bit of a drive, right? Yeah, that's a good context. And this guy, so the room was full. It was a weekday. People are busy. It's Boston. People have to make money to pay bills. Like, this place is not like the countryside. Like, by the time you're going to an event in the evening, like, it better be something, So people showed up. He had a full room. of Black folks. And that's a thing. I feel like Black folks are very stingy with their time. They're like, I only go to places that are going to serve me, you know? I'm just not, you know? So I feel like, and parents are that. There were parents. These are not just young, like, teenagers that have the time and are just doing high school. These are adults. These are people that are having to show up whole families, and some of them even had their kids there. It's a packed room. I just noticed that, and it was just, for me, it was evidence that there is a hunger for something, and people are coming to get fed, and Dr. Umar Johnson is meeting a need, and that for me is powerful. And even though I do have, I don't agree with everything Dr. Umar Johnson says, and an example is what you gave. You know, I do feel like, and I can discuss that later, but all in all, he was speaking to something that is needed to be spoken about about the Black community, and needs that the Black community has. And as we all know, generally, these are needs that are often sidelined. So he's centering the needs of Black families and Black individuals. And that's so important. So that for me was just, I walked into that room with you guys. I remember we're trying to find a seat. I was like, this is a good problem. I was not even frustrated that I'm standing. I'm like, this is a good problem, you know? I'm like, yes, let us stand. Let us be standing, because people have shown up and there's something that is needed and it's being offered here. So I was like, I'm all in.
For sure. It's so crazy because as much as there were people and it was hard to find seating, everybody found a seat. Like, how did they manage that? They brought seats out of nowhere. Everyone found a seat, an actual like chair to sit on.
Yeah.
So big shout to him. All right, let's talk about the psychology, because he talked a lot about mental health, the sort of school experience of Black boys. You know, he talks about first of all, there are very few men who become teachers, and much less of them are Black men. And you know, I don't want to take away from anything that women teachers do, but I do think he makes a good point of like needing that male sort of intervention when throughout a young man's development, you know, particularly perhaps in communities where a lot of Black men are locked up. You know, I will stand by this forever, but all issues that you think about Black men start off with the incarceration issue, and then we can talk. But, you know, I will say, again, you know, it's hard to sort of step away from the controversial takes, but I mean, he talks about education, the way Africans talk about education. And I'm sure, Darrick, because you're now on the verge of achieving a PhD, you receive the same message. But as African immigrants, my parents are African immigrants, and I'm sure Kalo, yourself, but your parents as well. I mean, education is the utmost important thing on this planet. And regardless of what you have to say about Dr. Umar Johnson, he absolutely prioritizes and believes education is the ticket for many people. And he called out the NBA basketball culture, people wanting to achieve those dreams, which I have no issue with, because clearly a lot of people achieve it and they succeed and live great lives because of that. But, you know, I mean, education is just as good of a dream. There's an article I can send to you guys later. By the way, listeners, check out the show notes. The article says that, I don't know how they did their math, but they said that it's easier for a young Black man to become an NFL player than it is for him to become a school psychologist. So, you know, I bring that up just to say that, like, school psychology aside, education is a very viable sort of option and for people to build lives and careers. I'll just throw out a quick case anecdote. This is what we do, listeners. This is what we do as psychologists. We talk about cases all the time, and it's always fantastic. But when I was doing mental health in a community healthcare center, I had a young man, a Latino man who was 14, I believe. He had been prescribed stimulants since 5 or 6 or 7 or something. he at the time, at 14, was not doing well in school, was failing classes, skipping classes, and I had to get on a level with him that was sort of outside of all the bullshit and just be like, what's good, bro? Like, give it to me real, and fortunately, I think that is a benefit as being a black man. You can kind of talk on that level with young men of color. And I was just like, why are you being prescribed stimulants? How do we know that you have ADHD? Like, there's no recent evaluation. I don't recall, I didn't find in the glorious epic his evaluations from a younger age. And I just was like, there is something wrong with this. Why is this man just being prescribed stimulants just nonstop? No sort of concern for the effects or whether it's actually helping him. And, Dr. Umar kind of gave clarity to me, and he talked about how there's issues and disparities with black men and Hispanic boys getting prescribed ADHD medication. They're getting evaluations for learning disabilities, for oppositional defiant disorder. There's no rhyme or reason. These diagnoses are just kind of being thrown around. But the thing is that once you get slapped with it, you're funneled into a pathway that could very well hinder your ability to achieve education or even go to the NBA. So I think he made a lot of sense, which it turns out goes against the typical mental health orthodoxy. Anyway, I'm gonna stop. What do y'all think about that mental health side, the psychology side that he presented to us?
Yeah, so I think that Dr. Umar Johnson, he does justice. He does justice to Black mental health for sure. And I think that was one of my most exciting parts about his conversation. I feel like the places that I disagreed with him were most of the things that I disagree with Dr. Umar Johnson were outside of the psychology premise, which I love because, he is a school psychologist, and I love that his school psychology stuff is really dope and right on point. So one of them for me is that he genuinely loves Black children. I mean, you can tell that. And maybe that's why parents showed up. It's like, because they're used to most people not loving their children. And here's this dude that loves our children. He's not even met them, but has dedicated his career to seeing how to make things and education work for our children. And I think that's a really big need for Black parents in America. And I actually think Black parents generally, globally, because like I said, having grown up in outside of the US, I've grown up in Kenya, but I've also grown up in Europe. And I've never been in an education system where my needs as a Black child or an African child are centered. So I think that's one thing he offers: genuine love for Black children, and he sees that through education, which is also something that, like you said, Tunde, Black families just value. So as a psychologist, he talked about things that Black families would want to hear and always struggle to figure out and to navigate. And this is the piece of, what happens if you get a phone call and your child and you're told that your child has a behavioral issue. What happens when the school psychologist says that they have diagnosed your child with ADHD? What happens when the psychiatrist says that your child needs to go on medication? These are questions that are never addressed in public psychology. They're never addressed with a cultural lens that accommodate the concerns of Black families. Dr. Umar Johnson answers every single one, and he says the how. That made it for me. He says, here's what you do when the school calls and says that your child has behavioral issues. He says the how and the what, and he spells it out. And this is what drives it home for me. So he talks about the things that the Black parents are concerned with, but are never told about or talked to about. And then he goes on to say what to do. And finally, he puts himself there. He offers his services. He says, if you get an evaluation, psychological evaluation for your child, and you want a second opinion, which you ought to, as is a recommendation in the general medical field, that if there's anything super concerning about a diagnosis, you ought to get a second opinion. Anything that is regarding, you don't need to get a second opinion when you get a burn, but you need a second opinion for things that are, that will potentially impact your education and your future. So he says, I will offer second opinion for free. Listen, that is just that just made it for me. I have to give him credit for that, because we know how much psychological evaluations cost, and then we know that because of how much one costs, who's going to be going for a second opinion? Who has the time and the money for that, even if you want it? And so I feel like, what's the saying? Like, you put your mouth where your money.
Your money where your mouth is.
Yes, you put your money where your mouth. I think he does that, right? He just doesn't preach, but he was like, and he put out his email address and his telephone number. That was for me the biggest part, and it just demonstrates what it means to be a Black psychologist and to serve in this time. Yeah,
absolutely. Real quick, before you go, Darrick, I just want to say, these evaluations are so complicated. We've all done them, whether it's school evaluations or neuropsych evaluations or just general mental health psychological evaluations. I mean, these documents make no sense to anyone except psychologists and other mental health professionals. So I can't imagine a parent who has a couple children, who is working all day, maybe 2 jobs or something, who's not deeply familiar with the lingo of psychology, schools, education, who may even be an immigrant, may not have like the best mastery of English. I mean, the only real takeaway they have is the diagnosis. And if it's something that's pretty serious, like ADHD, a learning disability, learning disability is like a very, very serious diagnosis, in my opinion. I mean, it's basically saying that your child is not able to learn and is not able to sort of achieve the cognitive and intellectual ability that is expected of just, baseline functioning, So it's a pretty devastating diagnosis. And these evaluations, there's so many opportunities for bias, for, people kind of imposing their own ideas on people. Maybe some student in a classroom just acts up a little bit, has some behavioral issues. The teacher now is going to perhaps present like the ultra bias, ultra anger, or sort of angry conception of the student's behavior. So to have someone who was like able to kind of, go through the bullshit of these evaluations, I think is a huge value. Anyway, Darrick, your thoughts?
Yeah, I think, how can I put it? I think in this society, for people of African descent in this country, Africanness, Blackness, however you choose to call it, is secondary. It's an alternative option. It's presented as an alternative option. So when it comes to education, when it comes to curriculum, when it comes to how education, like who's leading education, all of that is sort of the cultural lens is for people of African descent. Their own narrative is secondary. So we can leave it there, right? Because that holds a that's like a drops the mic sort of experience culturally, to be in a place where something that's essential to you is just, it's almost on the other side of the door. Like I don't there's so many other things in life that we can compare to that and say like, oh, if this dynamic presented as it related to food or as it related to medication or something like that, like we'd be finished. So kind of like you said, Tunde, like there's this, for a lot of parents, especially a lot of mothers, there's a sense of helplessness that's experienced after a long day of working, just sort of largely probably being out of the loop on like the day-to-day happenings of the child. You have these meetings and you get this diagnosis, and um yeah, I think it means so much to have someone to give you the short and skinny of what things are and how to respond, especially when you feel overwhelmed, out of the loop, and you don't have the time. And to also for somebody to communicate that extra sense of care that's almost always present in African culture. So I feel like his extension of like offering his number and his email, or just like let me give you these extra points that you're not going to get, is an extension of like centering that the African lens, the Black lens on education. And it means so much to hear that, you know, and to see that and to have that model for a whole group of people of African descent in varying ways. And you know, the last point that I'll speak to is sort of a specific example of his cultural lens, with ADHD being "ain't no daddy at home" syndrome, which I think is pretty like it has a hint of humor to it, but it also has a huge sort of like cultural context. Ain't no daddy at home. And when you hear it, it's like, dang, that was kind of slick. That made a lot of sense. But once you go back, at least for myself, when I went back and, you know, you sit alone with that term, ain't no daddy at home, and you sit with it, like it sank down to the bottom of my stomach, because a lot of children of African descent, you know, have that experience of like where that particular role, that particular perspective is non-existent. And the gender roles and just the African family experience is largely cropped out of the context in the United States. So it just speaks to, I think, this, like, it was nice in the moment and it clarified a lot. It was just this quick punch, but it's almost like a atom bomb too, of just like everything that is captured in the experience of African youth in this country, who are I mean, almost in some ways missing a limb, like metaphorically, like expected to go through life and perform in the same way, but like missing this limb. And we forget what that means for how it impacts us physiologically, emotionally, socially, spiritually. And I feel like he connected that plug back to, like, you know, when we're missing our mother all day, you know, when our mother is absent, or our mother is like experiencing substance abuse, or when our father is incarcerated, or when he's just emotionally uninvolved or tapped out, you know, we can point to a lot of different things, but for us, we got to consider this stuff. So it's definitely I think it's relieving to add that context in, and to know that, like, you know, this is something that we can be way, like, this dynamic of like family roles and family context, we can be way more thoughtful about what this means for young people who are experiencing challenges in the classroom. So yeah.
I feel like this is, so Darrick, you're taking me to the things that rubbed me the wrong way with Dr. Umar. Yeah, I mean, and I don't know if we're going there yet, or we're still doing all the stuff that we took over.
Please.
Because, whew, so, and I feel Darrick was very, as is his nature, gentle as how he went about that statement. But, you know, one of the things for me that I feel that I would criticize, or Dr. Umar Johnson, is I don't feel like his comments or his perspective on gender and roles are, I don't feel like they're very contextual. I think that they're a little bit rigid for me. And you gave a good example initially for when you said, you know, he did give he invited all of us to this conference, couples conference or singles conference, I forget. But he said that women could only women with natural hair. Come on, listen. As in, are you for real? Are we in the 21st century? Like, how is that a criteria for coming to an event. And of course, he rationalized that by saying that's what that you know that is based off his Pan-Africanness. Now, listen, as an African in the room, I was like, "Are you for real?" I was like, "Really? Really? No." I feel we need to redefine Pan-Africanism, which is a question I have for you all. And I know I told you earlier I'd love to have that discussion. I think we do need to define what is Pan-Africanism, what is being Afrocentric, because I think that there can be some problematic perceptions of what that is, and problematic meaning that it may actually work against the cause, which is, you know, the unification of people and folks from the African continent, whether within it or without it. So anyway, so to this point about ADHD as an acronym for what's the acronym again?
Ain't no daddy at home disorder.
Yes, ain't no daddy at home. Listen, my body, like, that was another cringe. So I had moments where my body cringed, and it was the invitation that excluded Black women that have no natural hair, and it was this definition of this acronym for ADHD. And the thing about that acronym, ain't no daddy at home disorder, I think that it is. One of the problems with that is he does not give a context, and I think that's what Darrick was kind of speaking to. That it's really harmful, because do we even know how many of us in that room had no daddy at home? Are we aware of that as we are talking? You know, that was my question. Like, are you aware of? Do you realize that maybe even 80% of your audience did not have a dad at home? And are you aware that that's just on a personal level, okay? Which he did not even address, the awareness. So for me, I was like, dude, you're unaware of who you're talking to. And then the second part was, let's go to the larger piece, right? Why is that such a reality in the Black community in the US? Why is it? Let's talk about that before we even make this a disorder. Why is it? Because there's a structural piece to this, and you know, we can talk about what the US as a country and its history has done to the Black family, and specifically Black men. And there was no mention of that. I think it's problematic as a psychologist and a Black psychologist to speak about the lack of men in families and not give it a context. And I think it's hurtful and it's painful. And I felt like this. I felt it. I think that's important to say. So that's just jumping off Darrick's point. And then also, I think the final thing is, research-wise, being psychologists, we've had to study dynamics of family and family dynamics, and we've actually realized that it's not really the absence of a parent that harms children, but it's the environment. So the nature of the environment that is harmful to. So you can have a child grow up with two parents, but if it's a hostile environment, that is just as harmful, you know, as having one parent who is also harmful. And so it's not about the number of parents, but it's the environment that the child is in. And so there are many of us who have had a single parent and whose environment has been very healthy to the larger extent, and that is something important. And this is what the research has shown us. And now my last point on this is that there is also a study that has actually been cited by NIH, and that has been recognized by the CDC. And I'm forgetting the name, and we should cite this, Tunde, but that actually shows, they did a comparison between Black fathers, but not Black fathers, but fathers generally in the US, and in terms of how the presence of fathers in their children's lives. And hear this: Black fathers came out to be the most present in their children's lives, despite whether they were in the home or outside of the home. And this included even fathers. The study included fathers who are in jail. So, and presence means contact, communication. And there was all these things that define presence. And Black fathers actually were rated the highest in terms of presence. I mean, it's phenomenal. And so basically, I think Dr. Umar needs to read that study, honestly. Yeah, so just wanted to speak on that point.
Well, appreciate that. That's what we do on the podcast on #RTBTH. You know, we try to reference the research, the literature. Thank you, Kalo. You know, I agree. Like, I was actually cringing myself from time to time, and I didn't know how to really take it because I'm not a parent, you know, so I just, like, I step away from that conversation. But he said a lot of things like, if you stop being lazy, you know, go to school, you know. He would say this about, you know, parents, and he directed a lot of, you know, his, you know, whatever he was trying to communicate to mothers, to Black mothers, you know. And I understand there was a lot of encouragement in his words, but, you know, there was a lot of like disparagement about people being lazy, people worrying about their Instagrams and their social medias or their fashion, you know, their nails more than their kids. And I'm sure there are those stereotypes, but of people who are that way. But, you know, I just think it's a little unfair to think, okay, so let's say there is a mother who works a lot. You know, she's not able to go to every after school event. You know, maybe even her child comes home and they're alone for several hours. You know, maybe the child even has to prepare their own dinner, which is not uncommon, you know, in some low income inner city families. You know, I don't know if you can say that this person is being lazy, more so that they do not have the resources to attend to their child on the level that Dr. Umar is imploring them to do so, you know. So he spoke very assertively, very aggressively. I think he feels probably that this is for the better. And, you know, he has an hour, maybe 90 minutes to talk. So he doesn't have the time to like elaborate on every single thing in the most, you know, sort of profound way, you know. But, yeah, he definitely had his sort of abrasive comments, you know. Well, we already started waiting in that area. Let's talk about the controversy, guys. Let's talk about the controversy. Another thing that made me bristle. He said, do not invite your white friends to your home. He said that straight up. I asked a question. And he said, you don't have a white girlfriend, do you? And I don't have a white girlfriend, but I have a couple very close Black men friends who have white girlfriends and wives, and they are great people. And I just was like, Dr. Umar, I don't know how to make sense of this. I have white friends who I go to their house and we chill and we, you know, drink a little bit, you know, maybe smoke a little something, you know. We chill, we watch sports, you know. I don't know, like, should I listen to Dr. Umar? Should I cancel these white people from my life? So yeah, I mean, how do y'all make sense of this? The sort of controversial, the sort of real, like, inflammatory, I guess you could say, comments that he made.
Yeah, so I mean, in the words of the man himself, it's debatable. It's debatable. I feel like if it was a book or a movie, that would be the title. But yeah, I like that. I have an appreciation for being able to sit with these experiences and these sort of suggestions over time. And I do think they like, you apply certain lessons as necessary, like certain feedback is necessary. And I think it all depends on like the end result, you know, or the anticipated end result. And I think Dr. Umar has his own anticipated end result for Africans in the diaspora, and just for the progress, population, economics, awareness. And he is expressing the means of getting there, which is, you know, being mindful of interracial relations, you know, and I guess it boils down to whether, like, what's the anticipated end result for, for various folks, right? And what's their vehicle for getting there? Tunde, you may have your own anticipated end result for our community. And it may not, it may not align with his, and it may be the exact same thing, but you may just have a different sort of vehicle for getting there. So I'm just like, I feel like I'm still in a place of just sitting with it. I think a lot of this is kind of like a case by case sort of situation. Like maybe you're in high school getting this message and you're trying to figure out, okay, is Dr. Umar gonna diagnose me with the snow bunny crisis? Like, or maybe you're in undergrad and you're trying to have a good time, or maybe you're in grad school and you're on the come up, and you may not necessarily have the time for all the politics. But I guess what it boils down to after saying it is that there are politics, right? There's just certain dynamics that you can't get around as an African in this society. And I think at the end of the day, it sort of boils down to being very, very thoughtful of how to survive with integrity. Because a lot of the experiences that a lot of graduate students, undergrad students, I mean, we just got done talking about elementary school students with the misdiagnoses and the prejudice. You can't talk about racism in some places, attack on critical consciousness. There are politics and there is survival, unquestionably. Yeah, I think it boils down to how to survive. How do you survive with integrity? And that's his stance. And I'll say this lastly. I think it's important on finding out where the overlap is and how we survive, and not to limit our sort of narrative to just, we're just survivors. No, we are thriving and we have to thrive. But I think it boils down to like seeing the ways that we do that and how they overlap and how we agree to disagree in some ways about where we stand with our politics, and awareness of the consequences too, because there are consequences. And I don't know if we have enough dialogue about what the consequences of certain cultural experiences are. We talk about the spending power within the Black community in the United States, and given the level of that, there is a consequence for the lack of accountability or our misinformation around sort of our financial spendings as a community and as a culture, right? So I'll leave it there and I'll pass it along. But yeah, those are just my initial thoughts.
Yeah, I think this goes back to what I was saying. I do think that Dr. Umar Johnson, his strength is when he speaks about school psychology. I feel like that's his lane. And I'm learning it's good to stick to your lane because, yeah. So I don't feel like a lot of his ideas outside of school psychology are very well developed. And I feel like for such strong statements, you definitely need to develop like you need to give some nuances and to give some more information, because they're very simple and straight to the point, which we all know that life is not that rigid and it's not just about doing this or not doing it. And that's how I perceive some of his statements that are outside of the realm of school psychology, is that it's his position, like Darrick has said. But I also don't think that they're well formed. They're well developed, and that's fine. I have many things. We can't spend our whole life developing everything. So he's definitely done a good job in the school psychology piece, and that's his training. That's, I give him props for that. On the social critique piece, gender stuff, when it comes to family stuff, when it comes to, this kind of, friendship, what friendship looks like, cross-racial friendship, I feel like he definitely has a stance, which he has every right to. I do feel like, considering he is very well regarded, it would pay some humility to be like, that's not my lane. and just stick to my lane. But that's just that's my perspective. Yeah, I felt it was too black and white. But he's got his own. He's got the right to have an opinion. But it's too black and white for me.
Yeah. I will say, and I don't want to put words into my mother's mouth too much, but she has warned me on a number of occasions to sort of be wary of white people, and I think she talks about that as an immigrant. She came to the States, to the Bay Area, which is a very progressive place. But back when she was, growing up in the States, I mean, in the Bay, I think she maybe experienced some things here and there that were, untoward, I guess you could say. My dad as well, he talks about now waking up to some discrimination he's experienced just now as a 60-year-old man, kind of like becoming more aware of some of the discrimination he experienced. So I don't know. I don't think it's like, I mean, Darrick, you say nicely, like there's politics, there's cultural relations, race relations, and a lot of our interactions, as much as we want to sort of diminish those issues and those concepts, and we want to create harmony. And, I don't know, it's a complicated topic, but it's not like completely non-existent to many, many, many corners of the diaspora. Like we can say, okay, yeah, black people who grew up in the States or who grew up in the inner city in the States, they have that perspective. But it's not just that, my African parents have communicated a strain of that concept to me of like, be wary of, the white people in your life, be on guard, especially my mom always talks about black men in America, blah, 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 this and this and this. She's always sort of encouraging some kind of awareness. She's not overtly saying, she's not overtly saying like you have to just block out everything white in your life, but she is encouraging awareness. So I don't know. I will say this. The man is complicated. And I've learned through 2 elections with Donald Trump, forgive me for bringing that man into our conversation, but it's impossible to make sense of things in just black and white terms sometimes. And he is a part of that. He himself is a representation of that. Like, he's complicated as fuck. Look, as far as I'm concerned, he's preaching the right message about education, and he's imploring all black people to become more educated, to take education seriously. Here's one thing that he mentioned. He said, try if you can to go to HBCU, but if you can go to North Dakota, Wisconsin, Wyoming for free, go send your children there. He said this. He said, send your children to get an education. So he's willing to sort of break down his, I guess like inherent or innate like protective or defenses towards white people, I guess you could say, for people to get education. He's imploring people to go and weather whatever those circumstances are in North Dakota to get an education. So to me, he's preaching the right thing on that front, but on other things, he's, I would say, off base, so it's a complicated man. We had a great podcast, Kalo. I gotta set us up for the next podcast. You said that even in Kenya, you felt like the needs of black children, black students were not prioritized and put to the forefront. You had to go find other communities to explore that interest and that necessity, that need for yourself. And I'm just wondering, how does Western psychology even sound to you? Like the theories, the diagnoses must just sound insane. Thoughts, Kalo? Thoughts, Darrick?
I'm reflecting on what I definitely like the word complicated, that we are complicated human beings. And I think that's so important also as Black folks, because I think that there's a way that Blackness can be like described as so hegemonic, like just as a simple one layer slate, and yet there's so much to people of African descent, because they're people at the end of the day. Yeah. So I like ending on Dr. Umar as he's a human being. It's
Absolutely.
complicated. I love that. Yeah. Psychology, Western psychology, the problem with it is that it doesn't even call itself what it is. It doesn't call itself Western psychology. It calls itself psychology. So you go into it, thinking that it is all encompassing and all like that you will find yourself somewhere in there. And then you learn that you don't exist in that psychology. So that I think that's for me, I can set us up by just saying the fact that it doesn't even show it doesn't own itself. It's from the beginning, it's a lie. Like it doesn't own who it is. And I think that's so problematic, especially because it is being taught in places outside of Euro-American spaces. So there's a lot for me that was when someone doesn't present themselves to you as who they are, so you go into you're constantly getting shocked, like every time you're learning something new about them, because it's kind of like, like it's like, because they say they're this person and then they're not, and so you constantly it's a really strange, if you think about it, it's not a healthy relationship when you're working with someone that is presenting themselves as one thing but they're actually another. And I feel like psychology just needs to call itself what it is: Western psychology or Eurocentric psychology to begin with, as it goes out into the world. So I'll just start there.
Gotcha. And real quick before you go, Darrick, I just want to say, like, I did like I took like history of psychology or whatever 3 years ago or so, and I was like, and we had to do a project, and me and my partner did like a brief presentation on like Nigerian psychology and like some Nigerian researchers, psychologists, and I was like, if the whole entire concept of psychology and mental health started in Africa, I don't think it would be like, I know for a fact it wouldn't be what we have today, because a lot of it is dependent on culture. Other communities, other African communities rely heavily, deeply on a communal experience. We talk about fathers not being around and families getting caught up and not being together fully. I mean, in Africa, and Kalo, I know you know this much better than I do. I mean, it's literally raised by community, raised by village. Like, your mother could go and move to another country and you'll be good because you have aunties and grandparents and other neighbors who will raise you as if you're their own. But so things like that, I feel like if you started psychology in Africa or in another country that's not inundated with Western influence, it wouldn't be the psychology we have today. And I just think, specifically for you, Kalo, from your upbringing in Kenya, you're being raised in Kenya, like this stuff probably has to just seem so insane to you for what actually is meaningful for people. But we'll save that for another podcast. Darrick, your thoughts?
Yeah, so I agree with these sentiments, and I think that Western psychology, doesn't identify as what it is, and so much of its contents come from it doesn't come from here, and there's so much dialogue and conversation that needs to happen about the details of that, and where these ideas and concepts and understandings originate from. And again, going back to the consequences, what are the consequences of not putting things in their rightful context, and the consequences of not giving credit, proper credit, to where things come from, especially because these things are culturally bound. Some of these understandings were made for communities and cultures who operated and functioned in a certain way, and weren't necessarily meant to be, so altered and transformed. Like, there's so much that we can really consider with this understanding. And yeah, I'll leave it there. I think it's so important to think about proper context, to think about how we as people of African descent, how we access the content, the context, and hold it closely and consider like I guess some of the potential outcomes that are happening in the future. You know, we have artificial intelligence, we have so many policies and laws and dynamics that are existing to damage the cultural experience. Some classrooms we can't talk about racism. Like my mind is just blown at these dynamics and how we're expected to continue thriving or to reach our cultural potential, given the dynamics as they stand. So it's so important to really hold the context and give culture its proper credit, give these ideas, give the proper credit to where these ideas are coming from, so that we can sort of move forward with the best understanding of psychology and how to support the people in the diaspora.
Absolutely, Dark. Thank you for your comments. I think that's a great time and place to finish this first DKT podcast. I got some homework.
DKT.
Yes,
I got some homework. DKT definitely goes hard. I got to go read about, call it Black psychology, African psychology. There are theorists, as I'm sure you know. Our beloved Dr. Martin Pierre, he's spoken to me about theorists from other parts of the world, Africa, perhaps maybe in the Caribbean, who develop, theories about human experience and human suffering, and that to me, I think it's worthwhile to explore. This podcast has encouraged me and motivated me to do so. This is hashtag RTBTH. We're going to be back. This is not one, not two, but three Black psychologists talking to your earlobes. Kalo and Darrick, thank you so much for coming on the podcast. Hearing Dr. Umar was great. Being with y'all was great. But I think that, there's a conversation that we can create that sounds interesting. We'll see after this podcast is published. Any last words?
Just want to say thank you both for sharing your ideas, your time, and your wisdom. Super duper appreciate just everything about your experience that you're contributing to psychology, Black psychology, and what happens next. So I'll be looking forward to talking more, and hopefully, for however it goes, checking out some more important figures, lectures, and thinkers in our field.
Absolutely.
Yeah. I want to shout out to Dr. Umar for, he created the basis for our coming together and, and having this conversation, which again just goes back to it's so important that he exists and that his voice exists, his complicated voice. And then and shout out to Darrick for bringing us together, for inviting us to Umar Johnson's talk, and for Tunde for extending this conversation through
such a great host.
Yeah. I'm feeling.
There was so much more to be said after Dr. Umar. It was sort of exploding out of us, so to speak.
Yeah. And you found a way to contain that. That's powerful. That's powerful, because that's the other thing. We're talking about this with Darrick, is that there's so much need for spaces like these where we can contain our ideas, because, like we've all said, our field has no space for our ideas and our thoughts. And there's no, in our curriculum, our thoughts and ideas, and there's no space. So we have to create them. So yeah, hashtag RTBT.
Hashtag RTBTH. Real talk beyond the headlines.
There we go.
Yep.
Thanks, man.
That's what we do on the podcast. We're coming back. We'll be back with more Real Talk Beyond the Headlines. Peace.